here. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces, students, former students, friends, new faces as well. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Sol, for that introduction. Thanks to all of the second year IS doctoral students for inviting me. I join you today from the exotic location of the GSE and IS building. So I'm actually here in the flesh because my son goes to the lab school. So it makes sense for me to be working from this building when he's in school. The GSE and IS building where I join you is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, which you might know as Los Angeles. So I'm going to share some slides. So my students are familiar with me being like, is this thing on? Here we go. Great. So the title of the talk today is the title of the book I have that's coming out very soon, which is Urgent Archives, Enacting Liberatory Memory Work. The book of the same title is coming out May 31st by Routledge University Press, and there will be an electronic copy available, hopefully as soon as it comes out, through the UCLA library. So please have a look at the library website to find it after May 31st. Today, rather than do an overview of the whole book, I'm going to present from one chapter. So chapter 3, which is called From Representation to Liberation. So many of you know my previous work, which addressed the ways in which marginalized, identity-based community archives counter symbolic annihilation of oppressed communities. That is the ways that predominantly white university and government archives have underrepresented, misrepresented, or completely ignored communities of color and LGBTQ+ communities. I've posited that community archives counter this symbolic annihilation with what I called representational belonging, empowering people who have been minoritized by mainstream media outlets and memory institutions to have autonomy and authority to establish, enact, and reflect on their presence in ways that are complex, meaningful, substantive, and ultimately positive in a variety of symbolic contexts, particularly archives, right? So that's the old news, that's the prior work. This presentation will build on and sort of go beyond those previous findings, specifically looking at the South Asian American Digital Archive, or SATA, for examples. So more specifically, I'm going to address the relationship between liberatory appraisal and liberatory outreach in community archives, arguing that community archives should build on recuperative and representational collecting initiatives to activate records to stop cycles of oppression. I'll introduce a new concept, corollary records, and I'll show how records from similar moments in history can be activated in the present to stop oppression now. I'll also argue that more robust and accurate representation of minoritized communities is a limited and limiting goal for community archives, however important it is. Community archives must aim for more than representation, I think, leveraging the minoritized histories they have painstakingly recuperated for liberatory ends. Through strategic outreach with activists, artists, and other community members, archivists can ensure the records in their care are activated to stop oppression in the present. Ultimately, the chapter and the talk today argues that community archives must pair liberatory appraisal with liberatory activation in order to resist the white temporal imaginary. So, although this chapter draws on my experiences as a co-founder and ongoing volunteer for SATA, or the South Asian American Digital Archive, I have not directly worked on the 3 main projects that I'm discussing today, other than digitizing some of the collections that the projects draw on and providing some very general feedback. That said, I'm in constant conversation with Samit Malik, who's the co-founder and the executive director of SATA, and I often provide informal advice and feedback when asked. So as such, I cannot claim to stand entirely apart from the work addressed in this talk. I make no assertions of being an outside researcher, though I am definitely a white outsider to the South Asian American community that I'm talking about. But rather, I'm an integral component of the phenomenon my work describes in a manner consistent with a lot of participant observation as a research method. I also cannot claim ownership or take credit for the archival labor that I'm about to describe. So I shift back and forth between using we and they pronouns in discussing the work of Sata to reflect when it's appropriate. So I'll use we when I have taken part in the work, and I'll use they when I haven't. So let's get started talking about Sata, which is how I usually start. And I think many of you know me as students, and you know that I always talk about Sata quite a bit. So speaking at a July 2020 community-wide open Zoom meeting, Sata Executive Director Samit Malik said, quote, "As an organization, even though we are thinking about and engaging with the past, our work has really always been about the present, the now." The meeting was called by Malik in the midst of three intertwined crises: a global pandemic that had disproportionately devastated Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. Second, the ongoing state-sanctioned murder of Black Americans brought to the fore by the murder of George Floyd. And third, inept, malfeasant white supremacist national leadership in the White House. Malik said, "We have some good news to share in the midst of this challenging time." And I have a copy here of the Eventbrite invitation for this meeting. So the July 2020 meeting was an opportunity to celebrate the organization's 12th birthday, to announce a new grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation that would help support the organization for the next 2 years, and to launch a fundraising campaign with supporters. It was also an opportunity to demonstrate the archive's value by drawing on what I call corollary moments from the community's past to make sense of the seemingly senseless and increasingly overwhelming present. At that moment, that meant activating records in Sata's collections to inspire action around these three major events: the COVID-19 epidemic, the movement for Black lives, and at that point, the upcoming 2020 election. So there is little doubt we are living through a historic moment, reads the second paragraph here of the opening text, for Sata's participatory initiative to document South Asian American experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Launched in April 2020, so right after we were all sent home in March of 2020, the project, which is called Letters from 6 Feet Away, asks South Asian Americans to write a letter to their future selves about their experiences with the pandemic. With the creator's permission, the letters are included in the archives and mailed to the creator a year after submission, quote, "in hopefully better days ahead." Participants respond to a series of prompts online, upload a photograph of themselves, designate degrees of privacy or publicity from a continuum of options provided, and submit a mailing address in which they would like their letters to be sent back to themselves in a year's time. There's also a space to honor a loved one who's passed during the crisis. The submissions that have been publicly shared with the permission of the creator are deeply personal and self-reflective, and collectively they offer a window into a wider community ethos of grief, feelings of isolation, and the search for solace. In these letters, historic traumas surface and resurface as South Asian Americans learn to cope with the new reality. For example, in her public entry, and I'm only citing those entries which are public, her public entry to the project, Samara Ghosh of Texas writes, quote, "I would remember the first news that we need to store food. My first instinct was to buy rice and salt at Gandhi Bazaar. It was a reaction to historic trauma that my community went through. Bengal had a big man-made famine post-World War II, and rice and salt were in scarcity. I had heard stories of what my family went through. I was surprised that this deep-seated insecurity had resurfaced," end quote. So in this case, the Bengal famine of 1943 emerges as a powerful intergenerational memory being relived even though the writer herself had not directly experienced it. She continued that getting groceries delivered in the early days of quarantine, quote, "felt like Christmas morning." For some participants, the pandemic surfaced deeply ingrained traumas and enacted circular temporalities as if history was repeating itself, oceans and decades away in a vastly different context. So the letters are created to be read at what I would say a non-corollary moment in the near future. It's the hopes that in a year's time, or maybe a year from now, because the project is still ongoing, even after a year, when the pandemic has presumably subsided, or at least its demands on us have shifted, that activating these records by reading them will reveal some new insight into what it means, what it will then be at that present moment. So the project builds community as well by building a platform for letters to be shared with each other. But more importantly, it underscores the affective or emotional importance of the creation of records to participants. Those who write letters to themselves feel validated, heard, documented in the historic record, even if they choose not to share those records with others or through the archive. In a year's time, the project transforms the records creators into records users as participants read their own letters from the not so distant past. It also ensures the records will be activated by these new users in the near future. In so doing, I think it inaugurates a cyclical temporality, catalyzing movement back and forth along a pendulum, swinging back and forth between now, a year ago, a year from now. And the first chapter of the book is really about cyclical temporalities. So after inviting attendees of the July 2020 community meeting to participate in the Letters from 6 Feet Away project, Malik then pivoted to another crisis that was at the forefront of everyone's minds: the proliferation of and impunity for state-sponsored violence against Black people. South Asian Americans have a complicated history with the American racial hierarchy, as many records in Sata attest. Some early immigrants from India align themselves with whiteness to varying degrees of success and failure, while others passed as Black. The 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act that enabled South Asians to immigrate to the US in larger numbers would not have been possible without the civil rights movement and without Black activism. Yet anti-Black racism remains an ongoing problem within the community, despite the efforts of many South Asian American activists against that kind of anti-Black racism. So for Samit Malik, the July 2020 meeting was an opportunity to further position Sata as an organization committed to justice for Black people. Acknowledging these complex histories, he drew connections between the ongoing movement for Black lives and corollary moments in history in which South Asian Americans were involved in activism for Black liberation. Yet he also directly confronted anti-Black racism within the community and did not gloss over its history of aspirational misalignment with whiteness and white supremacy. Quote, in response to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others, we are sharing stories from our community's past that help engage our community today in the struggle against anti-Black racism, end quote, he said. He then recounted the story of H.G. Mudgall, an Indian immigrant to Harlem in the 1920s, who became the editor of Marcus Garvey's newspaper and an outspoken activist for Black independence. Quote, he said, H.G. Mudgall's story is a reminder both of the historical possibilities and duties for South Asians to engage in solidarity with Black communities, but moreover, the urgency now for us to engage in these solidarities and to address anti-Blackness within our own communities, end quote. He continued, quote, to be able to share these stories from the past, to be able to engage with contemporary discourse and dialogue and movements has been really rewarding and enriching for us as an organization, and I hope they help to move our community as well. So Malik's comments comments reflect a temporality of urgency, I think, in which records from the past are invoked to inspire contemporary political action now. In this way, the 1920s are set up as a corollary moment to the 2020s, and records documenting H.G. Mudgall from the 1920s are set up as corollary records to those being created by South Asian American activists fighting anti-Black racism now. By catalyzing corollary records from corollary moments, Malik showed precedent for South Asian American solidarity with Black Americans, evoking historical possibilities, as he put it, that align the community with the contemporary movement for Black lives. These activations, again, forge, I think, a cyclical temporality that dispenses with the racial progress narratives of white time. what Charles W. Mills calls white time. Instead of insisting that it gets better for minoritized communities, these efforts show how oppressive histories repeat, how historical possibilities can be invoked to forge affinities and solidarities in the present, how a precedent of anti-racist activism can inspire action for Black lives in the now. In this work, archives become urgently relevant and crucially contemporary. The current moment demands more than the archive simply documenting these stories of solidarity in hopes some future users might find them. Sata instead catalyzes these records into action to forge corollary moments across cycles of time to create a temporality of urgency for the communities it serves and represents. Through its social media pages, Sata also highlighted contemporary work that draws on archival records and historical knowledge for ongoing activism for Black liberation. In June 2020, for example, the organization highlighted a series of drawings by Shabani Rao, a contemporary illustrator whose prior work has used records in Sata to depict South Asian American historical figures. She has a few comic books that depict historical figures drawing on records from Sata. Rao's drawings shared on the Sata site portray a variety of older South Asian American immigrants, aunties and uncles, as younger South Asian Americans might characterize them, in a range of clothing styles and skin colors, talking about the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. So I just have one of these images here, but they come in different forms. In Rao's drawings, these aunties and uncles place the murder of Black people by the police in the US within the context of a long history of violence against Black communities and describe ongoing protests against this violence. And you can read right here, it says, the mainstream news describes these protests as riots. Remember, even our struggle against the British, which Black activists in America supported, were also described as riots. Let's be on the right side of history and support our Black community as they fight for freedom and safety. The drawings end with a call to donate to end state violence against Black people today and a list of websites, as you can see, of Black-led activist organizations and bail funds where donations can be made. So this work is really intended for younger generations of South Asian Americans to pick whichever auntie or uncle image best resonates with them and share it with their own aunties and uncles and people in their parents' generation. Rao's posters also, I think, invoke a corollary moment, Indian independence from colonial rule, to garner South Asian American support for the contemporary movement for Black lives. By showing how the word riot was weaponized against South Asians in a just struggle against British rule, Rao asked South Asian Americans to question the use of the term to describe protests against impunity for the murders of Black Americans. In so doing, Rao forges a solidarity across space, time, and community, creating a corollary moment between Black and South Asian communities. The posters also give language to younger South Asian Americans attempting to have conversations about anti-Black racism with their own family members. And as such, I think they compel action, right? They're not meant to just be looked at. They're meant for us to do something, or particularly for younger South Asian Americans to do something with them. So thirdly, Malik's final announcement at the July 2020 meeting also conveyed the urgency of the past by forging yet another corollary moment with the present. Looking ahead to what was then ahead to the November 2020 US presidential election, Malik discussed a video Sata produced in May 2020 featuring Roni Bagai, whose grandparents, Vaishno Das and Kala Bagai, were among the first immigrants from India to arrive in the US, arriving in 1915. And I actually did digitize that collection of records along with my fantastic students a few years ago. And I want to play this video for you now. So I'm going to stop sharing these slides, and instead I'm going to share this video. So it's 2 minutes.
Why does your vote matter? Well, allow me to tell you a story. This is my family. My grandparents came here in search of a better life for themselves and their 3 sons, including my dad. They arrived in San Francisco just over 100 years ago in 1915, but it was a time of xenophobia and racism, particularly against those from South Asia, like my family. Shortly after my grandparents arrived, Congress passed a new law banning South Asians from coming to the US. But my grandparents were lucky. They were here together. They bought a home and started a business. In 1921, my grandfather even achieved his dream and became an American citizen. But just 2 years later, his dream was shattered. In 1923, the Supreme Court made it illegal for South Asians to be American citizens. My grandfather's citizenship was nullified, and he was left without a country to call his own. This destroyed him, and sadly, a few years later, he took his own life. In a letter he left behind, he wrote, "I came to America thinking, dreaming, and hoping to make this land my home. I established myself and tried to give my children the best American education. But they now say, I am no longer an American citizen. Now, what am I? What have I made of myself and my children? We cannot exercise our rights. Is life worth living in a gilded cage?" It was more than 20 years later before the laws were changed, and South Asians, including my dad and my grandmother, could finally apply for American citizenship. This is why voting matters. I hope my family's story is a reminder of what we've endured to get the rights we have now, how easily they can be taken away, and how hard it is to win them back. If you haven't yet, please register to vote right now. And please, please vote in November.
I'll stop it there and I'll reshare my slides. By the way, working with some activists who are based in Berkeley, we just got a section of Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley renamed Roni Bagai Way after the woman in some of the images that I just showed you in that video, which is super exciting. So in this brief video that I showed you, Roni Bagai articulated, again, a cyclical temporality, later echoed by Malik at the community meeting, that refuses the logic of white racial progress narratives. Progress is not a given. The granting of an ever increasing number of rights is not inevitable. Rather, these messages communicate South Asian Americans did not always have the rights to vote. Their ancestors fought for them. They could be rescinded, right? We might have to fight for them again. Oppressive histories are seen as being repeating, right? Repeating themselves. And the threat of this repetition looms really large in this video. So in just 2 minutes, I think this video counters white temporalities that assume the inevitability and desirability of a just post-racial future. Instead, we see a community weathering repeated attacks throughout history and using traces of the past to ward off the next attack in the present, drawing on records from corollary moments, in this case, the 1923 dismantling of citizenship rights to catalyze voter registration in 2020, right? So there's a temporal urgency to the past here and to archival activations of the past. So in each of these 3 examples, Sata is drawing on what I call corollary records from corollary moments to catalyze political consciousness and hopefully action in the now. Corollary records document reoccurring moments in time in which the same or similar oppression gets repeated. A corollary moment is a point in time with historical precedence. At their most useful, records can be activated in corollary moments in the present, so that community members can learn activist tactics and strategies and get inspiration to keep going. We've been here before. We have survived this before. We have resisted before. Corollary records assert, here's how. By activating these corollary records, Sata's community members are, if only for a second, interrupting reoccurring oppressions by learning from previous generations of community members facing corollary moments. So I think this is one way, a really important way, that archives can dismantle systemic oppression and engage in liberatory memory work by catalyzing the activation of corollary records in the past to inspire and strategize activism in the present. So these examples that I've given you from last summer mark a really important shift for the organization, a movement from collecting records for recuperative and representational purposes, what I would call a form of liberatory appraisal, towards using and encouraging others to use those records against oppression, in what I would call liberatory activation. So in the initial years of working with Sata, Samip, and other volunteers and I were stunned with the amount of materials we found that dated back before 1965, when US immigration law changed to enable greater numbers of South Asians to come to the US. Back in 2008, when we started Sata, we had read about California's early Punjabi Mexican communities and heard some rumors about a few anti-colonial activists along the West Coast from the turn of the 20th century. But we had no idea, really, of the wealth of records we would find once we really started to look. I would say we spent a decade sort of feverishly collecting as many of those pre-1965 records as we could. We were thrilled to fill in the gaps and silences we found when we had looked for South Asian American stories in dominant repositories like the US National Archives and Records and University Archives. I would say our initial aims were recuperative in the sense we were trying to recuperate these lost histories to pull them back from oblivion into the community's consciousness. Our work was also representational in the sense that we were trying to increase the amount and types of representations of South Asians in US stories about the past. Recuperative and representational collecting kept us busy for nearly a decade, and guided by a very broad appraisal policy, we discovered and digitized more than we had ever anticipated about, say, South Asian American history. Building on Duff and Harris's naming of liberatory description, I characterize these initial recuperative and representational collecting impulses as a form of liberatory appraisal. So appraisal, as many of you know, is the process by which archivists assign evidentiary value to collections of materials, resulting in important decisions about what is archival, what falls within the organizational scope, what gets collected, what gets excluded, and ultimately what gets destroyed. So appraisal theory has really preoccupied archival studies for a century, resulting in a host of theories, strategies, and tactics archivists employ to make appraisal decisions, including assigning notions of primary and secondary value, functional analysis, documentation strategy. For those of you who've taken 433 at UCLA before, these should be familiar terms. Recently, I've proposed feminist standpoint appraisal as a type of liberatory appraisal that acknowledges the positionality of the appraiser and seeks to center the needs of those most disempowered due to the interlocking oppressions of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. In placing value in materials created by minoritized communities, in appraising them as worthy of retention and preservation, and in thinking about the affective, material, and political consequences of such decisions on the communities represented in such records, archivists engaged in representational and recuperative collecting can be said to engage in a type of liberatory appraisal. Still, I think for Sata's staff and communities, merely representing Brown people in US history has never been enough. For years, Malik and community members have discussed how, if the archives only collected the records of the most prominent South Asian Americans, the collection would replicate the same forms of erasure it sought to combat. What good would a South Asian American archives be if it only validated the experiences of straight cis upper caste men? Keenly aware of these archival silences, Malik consciously sought out collections created by South Asian American people and organizations further minoritized by gender, caste, sexuality, region, religion, ability, and class. Over the years, it became increasingly clear that for Sata's collection to be inclusive of those most minoritized within South Asian American communities, we would have to think outside of the box of dominant Western appraisal, catalyzing the creation of new records rather than simply searching for pre-existing records to digitize alone. In 2019, with the support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Sata launched the Archival Creators Fellowship Program, which in its first iteration partnered with 3 fellows to create archival collections that reflect the histories and perspectives of some of the most marginalized groups within South Asian American communities: Dalit women, Indo-Guyanese immigrants, and queer and trans people. Each of these 3 collections has a significant oral history and storytelling component that depart from dominant archival practices. For example, they allow for participants to remain anonymous if they so choose, given the real threats of violence Dalit, trans, queer, and gender nonconforming community members face. Sata's in the second round. We have 6 fellows now, which is really exciting, the second year of this program. And this project reveals how, in the absence of robust pre-existing documentation, recuperation alone is not enough. While it's crucial to catalyze the generation of new records that fill in gaps in order to truly center minoritized communities, archives must also respect silences, resist surveillance, and honor consent. This will mean changing commonly accepted practices and policies. So our initial twin impulses of recuperation and representation were motivated by what I would come to describe as countering symbolic annihilation with representational belonging. So many of you have read my work in that vein. By finding, digitizing, and providing access to as many records documenting the early history of South Asian Americans as we could, we were countering the community's symbolic annihilation in history with a powerful assertion of existence and belonging. And I still think that is true. Clearly, experiences of seeing yourself and your community in history after being excluded or misrepresented due to racism and or heteropatriarchy are emotionally powerful. Nearly every interview and focus group that I've conducted and that my student researchers have conducted with the volunteers, staff, users of, and donors to minoritized identity-based community archives over the past 5-6 years confirm the affective impact of robust representation after repeated and extended experiences of symbolic annihilation in mainstream archives. This affective or emotional impact, archives provoking the feeling of self-recognition in minoritized communities, can be an important emotional element of liberation. It is joyous to see yourself robustly represented after feeling symbolically annihilated. This joy is inherently political in a system that's designed to oppress. And I think here it's important to note that symbolic and actual annihilation are intimately related. So symbolic annihilation both precedes and succeeds actual annihilation, such that individuals and communities are rendered expendable, invisible, or non-existent before they are subject to violence, particularly state-sanctioned violence. And then after violence, such murderous acts are often rendered invisible or expunged from the record, magnifying and mimicking the violence itself. So every dehumanizing misrepresentation in archives that says you are not quite human, and every archival absence that says you are not important enough to collect, adds up to create the conditions that enable mass murder or genocide to occur. And then after such violence happens, every dehumanizing misrepresentation of that violence in archives that says you deserved it anyway, and every archival absence of that violence says your death is not important enough to note, also add up to conditions that justify mass murder and or genocide, grant impunity for it, and enable it to occur again, setting us all up for the fallout next time. So given this link between symbolic and actual annihilation, any discussion of liberatory archives must assert the importance of robust representation and recuperative collecting. Liberatory appraisal strategies such as these seek to center oppressed positionalities by assigning value based on the needs of oppressed communities. These needs may include valuing records for evidentiary purposes, as in the case of potential legal redress, or for affective purposes, in the case of countering symbolic annihilation with representational belonging. It matters if you see yourself represented in history. It matters if others can see you represented in history. That is true, I think. But still, representation is not the only or ultimate goal of liberatory memory work. So too often, recuperative collecting projects fall into a trap of respectability that is ultimately counter to the aims of liberation. A politics of respectability insists on collecting records that conform to dominant expectations about what a minoritized community should be. This is true of many university-led projects that seek to recuperate the history of minoritized communities by documenting their prominent firsts: the first politician from a given community, the first business leader, the first actor. Filling archives with celebratory success stories from prominent leaders can reinforce harmful stereotypes that blame oppressed people for their own oppression. right? Many Asian American community archives, for example, undergird model minority myths that thinly veil anti-Black racism. Such collections, whether they are in dominant or community-led archives, are about inclusion within oppressive systems rather than about liberation from them. And I think they pander to dominant groups instead of resisting the domination. Furthermore, as many trans activists have noted, the heightened visibility brought by increased representation can further expose vulnerable communities to violence and other forms of oppression. This paradox, simultaneously holding intention, representation, and endangerment, visibility and invisibility, presence and absence, speaks directly to cyclical temporalities, as minoritized communities respond to repeating cycles of oppression and flashes of liberation. The desire or need to be seen and heard changes over time in response to the larger political climate. Visibility, one might ask, for whom? In this context, recuperative and representational collecting can be exploitative, extractive, and harmful, the result of oppressive appraisal policies if downstream use is not considered. So given this complexity, more representational collecting is not necessarily the result of liberatory appraisal, but it can be. Recuperative and representational collecting can be liberatory appraisal strategies if they are part of a larger liberatory project. Thus, liberatory appraisal is the process of determining the values of records in regards to their potential activation for liberation struggles. Contrary to the past century of dominant Western appraisal theory, for those of you who've taken the appraisal class, liberatory appraisal considers the potential uses of records in making appraisal decisions, and further asks whose uses and for what aims. In this sense, liberatory appraisal is intimately tied to liberatory outreach, as it is only in the activation of records that their full liberatory potential can be realized. Its undergirding assumption is that archives can catalyze particular kinds of use, political, artistic, activists, by modeling that use in their own practices and by targeting outreach efforts to groups engaged in liberatory work. So my argument here echoes, but also complicates an argument made by Jarrett Drake in a 2018 blog post in advance of the excellent Architecting Sustainable Futures event organized by Burgess Jules and the staff of Shift Design. Questioning any easy notion of community in community archives, Drake writes, quote, "Archivists must shift their paradigms away from the fictive notions of local and community-based towards a more radically precise and politically liberatory language," end quote. Drake importantly pinpoints an aspirational shift from recuperative and representational archives to liberatory archives, but he does so in a way that I think simplifies the existing archival studies literature. Jarrett Drake identifies the ways that community can be invoked as a euphemism to talk about minoritized people without a power analysis, that is, without addressing the oppressive systems that minoritize them in the first place. I've frequently witnessed the phenomenon that Drake describes, particularly regarding self-described community-based collections, or even worse, self-described community archives that are in fact at university repositories, in which predominantly white-run institutions seek kudos for extracting materials from Black, Indigenous, people of color communities in ways that reinforce and replicate white supremacy, rather than interrogate and dismantle it. And this is a common phenomenon that Drake is really right to point out and to disrupt. Yet I think the archival studies literature of the past decade details the messy work of community. So those of you who are in my community archives class that's going on right now know that we spend the first 3 or 4 weeks dispensing with notions of community as warm and fuzzy places of belonging, because they're anything but that often. So yet Drake rightfully pushes the field beyond recuperation and representation towards more incisive, specific political aims. We do not need more collections that do the work of oppression in different colors and by other names, right? We need new kinds of collections, new kinds of organizations to care for them in order to enact liberatory practices. So community archives, it's become increasingly clear to me over the past 10 years, must leverage the recuperative and representational imperatives to activate corollary records across corollary moments in the present for liberation from oppressive systems. the work of archives and the work of activism, the work of representation and the work of liberation cannot occur on separate but parallel tracks, right? They must be intertwined. My use of the term activation here builds on Dutch archivist Eric Kettelaar's work. So writing back in 2001, Kettelaar disputes dominant Western notions of records being fixed and stable, instead arguing that records change over time with each use. I agree with Kettelaar's assertion that records, and by extension archives, accumulate layers of meaning over time through activation, to which I add this notion of liberatory activation here to describe those interventions in and uses of records that seek to dismantle systems of oppression and imagine and enact new possible worlds. It's not enough for archival institutions to collect records documenting minoritized communities or activist movements with a vague notion of some future potential use, right? These records must be activated by archivists and users for liberation struggles now. Archives, like many other cultural, social, and legal institutions, have a largely unrealized liberatory potential. So realizing this, realizing the imperative for liberatory archival activation changed how I did work for Sata, how I discussed Sata's work with others, and particularly with others in the organization, so within Sata itself. After a decade of recuperative and representational work with Sata, Malik, myself, and other Sata community members subtly began to shift our focus, I think, from collecting more representative records to activating the significant body of records we have already collected towards liberatory ends. And I want to say this is an ongoing journey. The three projects that I described at the beginning of this talk are important milestones in this pivot, but I think there's still a long way to go. These initiatives, I think, signal an important pivot, again, towards liberatory activation, and I really hope foreshadow future directions and future work. So as this talk has asserted, the relationship between representation and liberation in community archives is not either or. It can and should be both and, right? The typical feminist answer here is both and. Community archives can counter symbolic annihilation through liberatory appraisal that robustly represents and recenters the needs of the most marginalized and vulnerable communities without extraction or exploitation. Recuperative and representational collecting efforts can provide important material to counter symbolic annihilation with representational belonging and change dominant narratives of dehumanization that lead to the actual annihilation of BIPOC and LGBTQ+ communities. But archives should not stop there, right? We can push for liberatory use and outreach, activating corollary records in their collections to stop cyclical oppression in the now. Building archives around an acknowledgement of cyclical fluctuations in oppression and corresponding fluctuations in the desire, need, and ability to be recorded and archived is a direct challenge to white temporalities, and in particular, the white temporalities on which dominant Western archival theory is based, right? As described in my book, particularly the first chapter of the book, dominant Western archival theory fixes records in space and time, relying on a white temporal imaginary that posits time both as linear and progressive. So in this construction, the past precedes the present presages the future, and social conditions get better over time. In contrast, Sata, like many community archives, reflects a cyclical rather than linear temporality in which oppression repeats, records invoke corollary moments in the past and present, and records are collected in order to be activated to resist oppression in the now. So at the start of this talk, I described three of Sata's recent initiatives: Letters from 6 Feet Away, work in support of the movement for Black Lives, and efforts to encourage voter participation as examples of a community archives moving beyond recuperative and representational collecting towards activating records for political use. So this shift from liberatory appraisal to liberatory activation marks a new relationship to time for Sata. First and most obviously, it reveals the maturation of the organization after more than a decade of collecting. Now that we have a significant body of materials, we can encourage their use. But it does more than that, I think, reshaping the role and responsibility of archives in cyclical rather than linear time. In cyclical temporality, in which oppressive history repeats itself, the need, desire, and ability to be represented in archives fluctuates over time. This temporal construction resists the white temporal imaginary that asserts the linearity of time and the inevitability of progress. In catalyzing the activation of records to build corollary moments across space and time and community, Sata demonstrates that liberatory appraisal can propel the liberatory activation of records in the current moment. What these liberatory activations will be will shift over time as the political climate and needs of minoritized communities shift in response to the repetitions of oppression. Refusing the stable logics of white temporality is a critical aspect of liberatory memory work. In the book, I lay out 3 aspects that I think are important for liberatory memory work: temporal, material, and reparative. And you'll have to read my book to sort of hear more about those, or we can talk about them more in the Q&A, because I think the representational and temporal aspects that I've talked about today need to be coupled with material shifts, so material redistributions for liberation. So you have to read about it in the book. So thank you.
Thank you very